hard verses in our society today, because Peter talks about submission of a wife to her husband and about modesty. And our society is very feminist right now. And submission has become a bad word in our society. But people forgot what biblical submission of life really is. And we're going to get into that today. And then we're also going to talk about modesty, which there's also been a big, backlash against that too, where you have girls who are being shamed for what they're wearing, whether it's too much or too little, too much makeup, not enough makeup. Our society is very appearance-based, and Peter has instructions on how to deal with that too. So, in these verses, Peter is directly talking to the women and men later on in first century Asia Minor. Now, this place was Roman occupied at the time, so it was very influenced by Roman society. So verses 1 through 6 talks to women. And he's first addressing the women. And some of these women have come to Christ before their husbands have. And so they're talking to Peter, and they're like, Peter, what do we do? Are we supposed to leave them now? What do we do? How can we listen and follow a husband who doesn't believe in Christ? Now, at this time, this was rare, okay? Women did not follow a religion different than their husbands. Husbands set their household. They set the whole household. They were in charge of everything. Religion, the way their family worked, all of it. So for a wife to step out and follow something different was completely unheard of. And Peter's telling them, no, that's not what we're going to do. Following Christ is not a reason to divorce your husband. So we get into the first verses. So I'm going to read a few verses and then we'll talk about it. So like I said, I'm in Peter, 1 Peter 3 and 1 starts, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure nature. So Peter's telling them, you still need to submit. You're not better than them all of a sudden. And so you follow them. You're not nagging them, trying to pull them to church or act better than them. You simply follow their lead and do as God says. You live your life respectfully. Now, Peter does not say that's permission to follow your husband into sin. Okay? That's absolutely not what he's saying. But he's saying the submission that a Christ follower has is different than what submission of their typical society at that time is. Because in their society, the wives followed the husband. Peter is saying, follow your husband, but follow God first. And so this is a higher submission. He's saying you're still doing all the things you're doing. You're just doing more. There's a higher purpose now. And if you do this right, and you're gentle and he sees the difference in you, then maybe your husband will be like, hey, what's this about? You know, what's going on? Why is she suddenly different? And then maybe he'll be curious, you know? And maybe not. But you're still called to model Christ to him so that he understands it. Now, you know, for us, a lot of us have grown up, some of us have grown up knowing about Christ if you've been in church. Some of you it's still new to. But these women, you know, their religion was still very new at this time. So they didn't grow up knowing what Christ wanted. So these men were learning about Christ through their lives. So, talking about submission, I want to make a few things very clear in the beginning. Submission does not always equal obedience. Those are two separately, completely different things, okay? You can be submissive without being obedient. And I'll give examples of that here in a little bit in the next few verses. Submission is not based out of fear. Where the women in their society, it was based out of fear. Because women were property. They were literally bought and sold into marriage. Their fathers owned them, and then they were sold to the husbands, and then they were property of their husbands. So a lot of times, and I'm sure there were good husbands, but a lot of these women lived in fear. If they didn't do what their husband said, there could be some very heavy consequences to that. So a lot of them submitted out of fear. Our submission in a biblical sense is not based out of fear. It is based out of love and respect. Submission does not mean that we're going to agree with everything. I am married. I submit to my husband in a biblical sense. I agree that God put him as the leader of our family, and I am the helper. It does not mean I'm less than him. It does not make him my master. I don't have to agree with everything he says, but I choose to follow his lead unless it goes against what God's laws are, what God tells us to do. I will follow him, but I will not follow him into sin. Submission does not mean that your husband is your everything. Okay? Your husband does not make you whole. I hear that so much in this society, and it drives me nuts. He completes me. No, girls, he does not complete you. You are whole. God made you whole. You are whole without him. You are whole without a husband. God makes you whole. When you get married, being a wife means you complete a part of a unit, the two of you together. He does not make you whole. You make the marriage unit whole. Don't ever forget that. Submission is also not an excuse to stay in an abusive relationship. I want to make that very clear. Now, back in these days, the first century days, these women didn't have ways to get out of an abusive marriage. In today's society, we will not accept that. And it is okay to leave a toxic or abusive relationship. Okay? Submission is not an excuse to stay in an abusive relationship. Never ever. And if that happens, that's not on you. Okay? Because if you're doing your part, you can still love your husband to make that very clear. So don't ever, it's not an excuse, not at all. Submission is understanding that God chose the man, the husband, to be the leader of the family. Submission is agreeing to that and allowing him to step into that. He's not taking that place. He's not forcing himself into that place. We allow him to take that place. We allow him to be the leader. Submission is using your gifts and talents to support him in that role. That role as a leader of the family, that role in the leader in his work, helping him succeed in everything he does, whether that be at work, church, anything he does in the community. Whatever he does, we are helping him do that. And I'll get into more of that in a little bit. Right now I want to move on to verses 3 and 4. And this goes into the modesty thing. So, now hear me out, okay? Especially girls. Hear me out before you tune me out, okay? I promise it's not what you think it's going to be. So verses 3 and 4 say, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. So again, their society, these women would spend hours braiding their hair. They were constantly, they'd spend hours a day braiding their hair, putting on jewelry, choosing the right clothes. Can maybe girls relate to that? Maybe not hours, but I mean, we as women, as girls, we spend a lot of time on our appearance, right? These women went so far as using pigeon dung as makeup. They would make makeup out of pigeon pieces to lighten their skin, to lighten their hair. Look up, if you don't believe me, look up these practices. Look up the 1st century beauty practices, okay, in Rome and in the world at that time, because they did some pretty crazy things. Some of these things even were dangerous. They would use things like arsenic, lead, was all in their makeup, and it would literally eat their skin away. It would make them sick, and the women died from this. I don't know about you, but I am not so into my appearance that I'm going to die for it. But women still do that to this day. We're so caught up in our appearance that we'll go through surgeries because we're so insecure with ourselves and the way we look. We'll put ourselves through surgery after surgery. And I'm guilty of this too. We'll dye our hair because we don't like the color. We will do all the fad diets. Now there's a difference in wanting to be healthy, okay, and being so concerned with the way you look that you're yo-yo dieting and going back and forth and hurting yourself, okay? And Peter is warning these women, you don't have to do that because your appearance, the way you look on the outside is not what's important. What's important and what God sees in you is your character. The way you're treating other people, the way you're treating your husband, the way you are submitting to the authorities around you. And Peter is saying, remember what's important, what's really important. It's not what's on the outside of you, it's your heart, the inside. So I want to ask you this. If a stranger spent one day with you, one day. They didn't know you was a stranger. They spent one day with you. If someone asked them the next day what they learned about you, what would they learn? Would they say that you spent hours picking out the right outfit on your hair and your makeup? Or would they say that this person loved Jesus so much, and that's what they really got? And that's what Peter is telling them. Okay? He's saying that it's okay. He's not saying don't dye your hair. He's not saying don't worry about your clothes. But he's saying don't let that consume your life, because there are more important things. Our appearances are mirrors of our hearts, okay? And so he's saying, what are you reflecting? So the holy women, in verses 5 through 6, I'll read that first. So, for this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. So the holy women, it's funny because I did a lot of research on this because I thought, I'm missing something. I'm wrong, okay? The holy women, he says holy women were submissive, but in Old Testament times, most of the women in the Bible were submissive to God, but they were not necessarily submissive to their husbands. But that was a completely different time, too. But also, back then, when you have so much history to record, the submissive women don't always make it into the Bible. But he specifically mentions Sarah by name. And I'll backtrack for a minute. The holy women he's talking about, they did submit to Christ. And they were fearless. They trusted God. They were sometimes disobedient to the authorities, but it's because the authorities wanted them to sin against God. But they were always righteous, and they honored Christ in their submission. Going back to Sarah, he mentions Sarah by name, and Sarah was submissive to her husband. But there are times where she was not obedient to her husband. So, in verse 6, it says, Sarah called Abraham Lord. Now, when she calls him Lord, she's not saying my master, okay? Not at all. And actually, I'm going to read this verse to you. So the verse where she calls him Lord is in Genesis 18, verse 12. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? Now this is after God has come to them and told them that even in their old age, they're going to have a child. See, they've struggled with infertility to the point of them being disobedient and stepping out. And Sarah's old. She's past her childbearing years. She's already in menopause. She is not supposed to be able to have children. So when the Lord tells her, you're going to have a child, and she's laughing like, what? I am? No. And she calls Abraham Lord. But this is more like a term of endearment rather than her saying, my master. It's more like husbands or wives today going, hey babe, hey babe. So it's a term of endearment. It's a signifier that she's acknowledging his importance in her life. And it's a term of respect used with affection. In their culture, that was normal. You don't hear that today. It would be really weird to hear someone being like, my Lord. Right? That would be kind of weird. But here, hey babe, it's the same thing. So the ways Sarah submitted, and I'm not going to read the verses, but you can look them up at home. If you're not familiar with her story, I really encourage you, especially girls, I encourage you to look it up. It's good. So Sarah, before she was named Sarah, she was named Sarai. And it literally means princess. Okay? She was a beautiful woman. She was beautiful. It actually states it twice in the Bible. She is beautiful. Okay? So Sarah was not some lowly housewife. Okay? Yes, she was brought up to be a wife, but she was also educated. She was beautiful. I'm sure she was charming. Okay? They think that she most likely came from a more wealthy family. A family with a bit of a higher status. Okay? So then she goes and she marries Abraham. And then eventually, the Lord tells them to move. So Sarah moves. A long ways. Okay? This was a dangerous journey. Can you imagine riding by camel or donkey out in the desert and you don't even know where you're going, you just leave? Sarah did that because her husband said they were going, and so she did. So she submitted. I'm sure she wasn't happy about it. I'm sure she didn't want to, but she did. Now, sometimes submission is hard, okay? Sometimes we're asked to do hard things that we don't really want to do, but we do it because it's for the better of our family, because it's for the better of our husband. So twice, and this goes in Genesis 12, verses 10 through 20, and chapter 20, verses 1 through 18, twice Abraham asked Sarah to lie to a king. These kings wanted her. She was beautiful. She was wanted. And he was afraid that if the kings knew that Sarah was Abraham's husband, that they would kill Abraham to take Sarah for themselves. So he told Sarah, "You're not my wife, you're my sister." Okay? Which is only a half lie, because more than likely, when they go through the genealogy, she was probably like related. I think they were saying she was like a half sister, which is weird, yes, but the gene pool was not huge at this time. That was normal. But Abraham tells her, "You're not my wife. You're not my wife. I'm not your husband. You are my sister, and I am your brother." Because he was worried. He was selfish, and he was worried that they would kill him to take her. So Sarah submitted. Sarah was like, okay. And she did that. And I'm sure she didn't want to. I mean, I don't want to walk around saying I'm my husband's sister. I want to be his wife. But she did. She lied to the kings. And these kings, she even became a wife in every way to the first king. In every way, guys. Now, she did this because she was worried. She wanted to protect her husband. And the second king, he just admired her, but nothing really happened. She obeyed him, and she submitted to him because she loved him and respected him and wanted to protect him. She had to do hard things to save herself and him. She didn't care what happened to her as long as he was okay. She did that because she loved him. Now, Sarah didn't always agree with Abraham. And Abraham had a mistress, Hagar, and they had a son. And eventually, because Sarah couldn't have children, so she told him to take a mistress so that he could have heirs. Well, eventually, Sarah had a child, and that was going to be her heir. So Sarah, not agreeing with the way Abraham doted on the first son. She told him that he needed to let Hagar and his son go. Okay? And Abraham, of course, is like, no, you're the wife. I'm the husband. I'm not going to listen to you. Okay? But because Sarah had submitted her whole marriage to him, because she had done all these things and loved him and protected him, and the Lord came to Abraham and said, Abraham, you're going to do this. He literally says, listen to Sarah's voice. Do what she says. Now, it's not very often that God would tell a husband to obey a wife. But it's also telling you that sometimes the wives know what they're talking about. And while, yes, you are the leader, she still has a voice. She still has opinions. And sometimes she knows what she's talking about. So Abraham did. And he wasn't happy about it, but he did. Now going into verse 7, boys, don't think you're getting out of this. This applies to you too, okay? So verse 7 says, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as a weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. That comes with a very serious warning. He's saying that if you don't listen, you're breaking the communication with God, and He's not going to hear you. It's not very often where the Bible is going to say that God's not going to hear you. So this shows you how serious God is about marriage, and how serious God is about how precious your wives are. He cares that much about them that He's saying, we're not going to communicate. If you're not listening, you're an abusive husband, you're not treating her with respect. That communication's broken, guys. So he says an understanding way. And he's saying that as your marriage grows, your life changes. Okay? We all grow up. We grow up together. Make sure you're growing up together. Make sure you're knowing who she is. Even as life progresses, know what makes her tick. Know what she likes. Know what she's about. You have to really know her to respect her. It also means understanding the rules in marriage and how the marriage should be. And always understanding that and following that. And it also goes on, it says, honor the woman as the weaker vessel. It says, as the weaker vessel. Not that she is the weaker vessel. God is not saying, Peter is not saying that your wife is weak. Okay? That's not what he's saying. He's saying she needs to be protected because she is precious. It's your job to protect her. Okay? She is fine china. You know, we talk about trophy wives, right? Treat your wife like a trophy wife. Show her off. Respect her. Treat her well. That's what he's saying. He's not saying that she's weak. Because I promise you, women are not weak. We're not. And the last thing, some of the last things he says, and this is really important. He says, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life. Now, women in his time were not heirs. They didn't own property, women were property. So the fact that Peter is saying, hey, she's an heir. She's going to inherit this with you. That was revolutionary. Women didn't own things. If your husband died, the land or whatever didn't go to you, it went to your oldest son. Or a brother, or whatever male was next in line. They're supposed to take care of you, but they didn't always. We are heirs in grace. God is giving us property. That was revolutionary, because that did not happen back then. So the last thing, consequences. So that your prayers may not be hindered. Now, God doesn't turn his back on you, okay? What he's saying is that if you are not obeying God, he is not turning your back on you. I'll make sure I say this right. He wants you to make sure that you're taking him seriously, okay? Yes, he's upset. God is upset. He has not turned his back on you. Husbands, you have turned your back on God. And it is hard to have a conversation with someone who has their back turned towards you, right? This isn't how you talk to people. This is how you talk to people, right? So make sure that you're treating your wife with respect. Now you may ask yourself, now, okay, I'm not married. What does this have to do with me? Well, most of you will probably end up getting married. This is knowledge you have beforehand. These women didn't have this knowledge before. You have it. Boys, you have this knowledge. They didn't have it before either. This happens in real life for me. I brought my husband today to tell his testimony. This happens in real life, even today. So, I'd like to introduce my husband. And it was kind of funny, when I was preparing this, I didn't even think of the fact that, oh, I lived this. I literally lived this. So, I will let you tell your testimony.
So normally you guys would start a small group now, but since I've been asked to share a bit of my testimony, we had to play it a little bit. So, a little bit about my backstory. Before I met Denise, I was not a very nice or good person. I did a lot of bad things, did a lot of the occult, sorcery, tarot cards, stuff like that. Denise, I met online actually. We talked for 3 months playing 21 questions until our first date, which was Columbus Day. So, we got married. She moved to Evansville with me. She felt kind of empty. So, she went looking for a church. We didn't try too many before we found Catalyst. And the first Sunday we showed up, it was a service Sunday. She was excited about that because they were doing things in the community. I was excited because they weren't there. That, hey, win-win. We go to church, they're not there, I can go back home. But we came back, and slowly, in my past, I knew of Christ. My family wasn't religious growing up. We went to church maybe for a year out of my whole childhood before it was destroyed. And I'd seen the Bible, knew Jesus, just kind of pushed it to the wayside. But when Denise and I got together, she wanted to come to church. So I come to church, and I'm going to church for a couple of years before I even picked up a Bible again. Still, just going along for the ride. Then I started reading the Bible, and I'm a reader. You guys don't know who I am. I read a lot, graciously. I'm reading 3 books at the same time right now. So I started in Genesis, and I read it cover to cover. I've read it in 3 different versions now, the NIT, the ESV, and the HCSB. And study Bibles, whatnot. I've read a bunch of other literature about it, and it helped me to come to Christ. Without her leading me there, I would have never picked up a book and read it. I would have just came to church, not been a Christian, just been in the pews, sitting, listening, playing on my phone. But now I live for Christ. I give my testimony at work constantly. If you guys want, at any point, Denise can give you my information. I can talk to you. I've had a really rough childhood growing up. My 3 younger brothers are drug addicts, suicidal, and alcoholics. Hi, guys. So I've had it pretty rough. I came out not unscarred, but a little different than they did. I don't have any of those addictions. My addictions are in a different area. So without meeting her, I wouldn't know Christ, and I would still be on that spiral down. I would talk to the dark, and the dark would talk back to me. Before I met her, I was in the middle of creating a ritual to find a woman like her. And God's like, no, I'm back. So, thank you guys for having me. I'm going to turn you back over to Eric, and you guys can do whatever it is you do. Thank you.